Afternoon. Sorry that I was late. I was here. My wife is a little bit under the weather, so it took me delayed my process a little bit getting here. But nonetheless, I'm here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about something I believe is very important for this nation and for all of our communities. Just real quick, I'm the head pastor. Actually, it says Antioch Assembly. That's the church we founded. But I was recently appointed to another church, voted in as the pastor of St. Paul's Baptist Church in Harrisburg. So we're going to be combining the congregations, which is a very awesome thing, especially in this time in this season. I'm the founder of the 2019 movement. I'm also the chairman of the 400-year African American History Commission. And I'm here today in the role of the founder of the 2019 movement. But I will tell you very quickly about I'll tell you about the movement and I'll tell you about the commission. So the 2019 movement, we launched it in 2016 because the year 2019 represents the 400-year anniversary of the first African slaves that were brought to the British colonies of what became North America. The reason I think this is so important from a prophetic spiritual standpoint is that in July 30th of 1619, you had Jamestown settlement, where the first legislative meeting in Virginia, which at the time was the United States. Virginia was the United States at that time. July 30th, 1619, they had the first legislative meeting. August the 25th, less than a month later, they allowed slavery, the institution of slavery, to come into the United States. And so interconnected with the foundation of this nation was this thing known as slavery. Now, this year, I was down in Jamestown, July 30th, in the capacity as the chairman of this 400-year African American History Commission. President Trump gives me a shout out, acknowledges me that the commission was founded. It passed through both branches of Congress, was signed into law January of 2018, creating the commission. And I'll tell you what the commission's job is, but I thought it was interesting because not only did the president acknowledge the fact that the commission is in place, he signed it into law, but then that next month down in what is Fort Monroe, now is Hampton, Virginia, you had this gathering. It was the Day of Healing. We commemorated slavery and all this other stuff, and I didn't say celebrate, I said commemorate. Because in order for us to reconcile and move forward, it's very important, and we all know this from a spiritual standpoint, it has to be done in open, honest conversations. There has to be a certain level of repentance. There has to be a forgiveness, right? And so what I was able to do, and I think Bob might have seen me do this before, last year God had me to develop what's called the prayer of forgiveness, and we were able to I've been able to travel all over the country and to do this prayer of forgiveness. And I think it's spiritually important for this nation, especially from an African American standpoint. It doesn't mean that bad stuff didn't happen. It means we're no longer allowing that to have access to our hearts and our minds. Right? So I think this is a significant time. You guys know 400 years in Bible times is a significant time. Right? The promise to Abraham was that your descendants will go into Egypt for 400 years, then I'm going to deliver them with great substance, with great wealth, right? Now think about the pattern that happened when that happened. When God was about to send deliverance through Moses, what happened? There was an attack on the males, attack on the babies, breakdown of the family, and economic oppression, right? And then God sends deliverance. What's another 400-year pattern? Anybody know? I'll answer that. From the Old to the New Testament, it's called the silent years, right? God sent a deliverance through Jesus. What happened? Same pattern. Attack on the males, attack on the babies, breakdown of the family, economic oppression. God sends deliverance. What do we have in America in accordance to the black family? Attack on the males, attack on the babies, breakdown of the family, economic oppression. And we're in this 400-year window, which I think is going to be significant, not just for African Americans, but for the nation as a whole. Because the other part of the promise when he gave to Abraham was, I'm going to deliver your people with great substance, and then I'm going to judge the nation based on how they treated you. Amen? Amen? Amen. So the 2019 movement, we launched it in 2016. We were able to travel all over the country, many states, many places have had us come in. I was here with Lourdes a few months back, and she allowed me to share that with her. We identify some of the primary challenges that the African American community is facing, and we lay out a strategy for reconciliation, for healing, for restoration, to restore us back to our God-given destiny, not just for black people, but for the nation as a whole. Because again, I always like to stress that God says, I'm going to judge the nation based on how they treated you. Amen? Amen. Amen. Okay. Okay, this is the 400-year African American History Commission. It was H.R. 1242 was the law that passed through Congress, signed into law. Now we have Public Law 115-102. If you want to get a chance, you can go and look at it and to read what the law entails. And we were established as a 15-member commission. I'm the chairman. This is a picture of the Department of the Interior because we're under the Department of the Interior. And we commemorate his 15-member commission and to develop and carry out programs and activities throughout the United States to recognize and highlight the resilience and cultural contributions of African Americans over 400 years. African American history is American history. You know, it's interconnected, and there's such great contributions made by people of color to this great nation. And I always say that we have a vested interest in this country. I want to see this country succeed like anyone else. And some people have said, and I say this, maybe black people are the most patriotic because we fought in every war since the Revolutionary War, and even fought at time for the freedoms of other people when we didn't have those same freedoms. Think about the great Muhammad Ali, who said in 1960 he fought for the United States in the Olympics, won a gold medal, came back to Louisville, Kentucky, and was denied access to a restaurant based on the color of his skin. Jesse Owens ran against Hitler and the Nazis in Berlin in the Olympics. Won, what, 4 gold medals, 3? Right? Yeah. Proud American, came back. They had a ticker tape parade for him in New York City. The Wall of Astoria, they had a reception in his honor. He had to go through the service entrance because of the color of his skin. And so this is a time for healing and reconciliation, but we have to do it in an open and honest conversations, right? We can't just act like the past didn't happen. In order for us to move forward, we have to have. And I just say to people outside of the culture, whenever we engage in these conversations, it's important. These are important conversations. And whenever you're trying to reconcile with somebody, like for instance, let me give you an example. If a young lady was traumatized through molestation or rape, right? You wouldn't just go to her and say, just get over it. That was a long time ago, right? You have to hear, we have to have honest conversations. And the same is for African Americans. And I'm going to show you, this is not just about what happened 150, 200 years ago. These are some things that are still have affected us as people of color, and it affects the whole nation, right?
Absolutely.
So the purpose of my brief talk time with you today, openly and honestly discuss some historical events, talk about the challenges that face African Americans on a historical, cultural, and political basis, and offer possible suggestions to facilitate and reconciliate healing. And we'll do that in a few minutes, Bob. All that. So the slave trade, you guys are probably familiar with that. Now the slave trade didn't just start in 1619, it happened before that. But we're talking about the British colonies of what became the United States. It is estimated that the slave trade took place over a 400-year period where you have Africans being taken out and sold as property. 400 years, and 10 to 15 million Africans were taken from their homeland. This is a letter, the official letter from August 25th, 1619. It says, about the latter end of August, a Dutch man of war, the burden of 160 tuns, which are barrels, arrived at Port Comfort, which is Hampton, Virginia, Fort Monroe. The commander's named Captain Job, his pilot for the West Indies. One Mr. Marmaduke, an Englishman. They met with the treasurer in the West Indies and determined to hold consortship hitherward. When their passage lost one another, they bought not anything but 20 and odd Negroes, which the governor in Cape Marchand bought for victuals. So these 20 and odd were traded for food as human property. This picture back here is called the Middle Passage, and it's a depiction of what the slave ships looked like, how they would load the African slaves in there. This is another picture of that. At least 2 million Africans died in passage, whether it's on the ship or whether it was when they were marching them in the slave routes. Now here's the history of this country. Like I said, this is really interconnected and intertwined with the country. So of course you had slavery from 1619 until 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation takes place in 1863. 1865, there's a celebration called Juneteenth because there were some slaves in Texas that didn't know about the abolishment of slavery, and they were still living as slaves until one of the generals came in and set them free. So that was 1865. At the end of the Civil War, you had 1865, the Reconstruction period, which is when they began to rebuild, especially the South, which was decimated by it. And then you had the Reconstruction period. After the Reconstruction period, you had Andrew Jackson, and I like to point out these were all Democrats that were slave owners and promoted slavery. The Republican Party was the anti-slavery party, but Andrew Jackson actually became president, and they started with the Jim Crow and the Negro laws, where they actually overturned all the stuff that happened in the Reconstruction period and passed laws, segregatory laws. And the one thing I do, and I appreciate the gentleman who went before me, one of the things that I really get offended as a black person is when the LGBTQ people try to connect their cause with our cause.
Yes,
because we were fighting for the right to exist.
Yeah.
Right? I'm black if I'm asleep or if I'm a coma or whatever. I don't choose to be black. And people were actually, treated unfairly. I mean, we couldn't drink out of water fountains because of the color of our skin. That's not the same as me choosing to put on a dress. I'm sorry. Absolutely not. They probably don't make dresses my size anyway. So I tell people, blackness is a point of existence. It's not a choice, right? And the Bible doesn't say, thou shalt not be black. God created me black. No question about it. Then you had the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s, okay? You guys are probably familiar with that, but I'm going to talk about this devious plot that had happened, and it was under the guide of the government, right? So the 13th Amendment was interesting because it abolished slavery. It says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except for as a punishment for a crime. And so what they did in the South is they started to lock up black males, newly freed slaves, and they would put them on the prison chain gangs, and they used them to help rebuild the South. They also had what was called convict leasing, which some municipalities would actually lease slaves out, incarcerated black people out to help them rebuild roads and different things like that. It's called convict leasing if you get a chance to. And they start targeting black people, and they would lock up black males for things like loitering, not having a job, vagrancy, those type of things. And they would throw them on the chain gang and help to use that to rebuild the South, right? And this was under the protection of the laws, right? I'm not going to play these video clips for the sake of time, but the Department of Justice, as of December 2017, recognized that there were some stark inequalities in the criminal justice system. And I've been working with some other people for criminal justice reform, which is so important. Now, I'm not saying that if you don't commit a crime that you shouldn't go to jail, but what they found is you have a black male and a white male. The black male gets 2 or 3 times longer sentence for the exact same crime. They had what they call racial profiling, and I was a victim of that growing up as well. Young black man in an expensive car, you get pulled over and they start to search your car and they start to look for things because they said you must be a drug dealer. They start to profile. Now, if you're not familiar with this, 2 movies I would encourage you to watch. I'm not going to get detail. One called American Made with Tom Cruise. The other is called Kill the Messenger, Jeremy Renner. And these are true historical things that happen. So anytime you hear the government say a war on something, somebody's in trouble. So they had this thing called the war on drugs, right? The war on crime. And what they did is they found, and this is all documented, that, the whole thing with Oliver North, you guys remember that Iran-Contra, they found out that the CIA was allowing or overseeing the transportation of cocaine from South America into the United States, right? Coincidentally, you had an explosion of the crack epidemic in the 80s during the same time. Now, this is when it gets really tricky here, right? Because when they brought the planes in, they landed it in the state of Arkansas. Mena, Arkansas was the base. Guess who was the governor of Arkansas at the time? Gentleman by the name of Bill Clinton, who had to have given permission for that, right? Now you have the cocaine that ends up in South Central LA, these black neighborhoods. Then you have this guy who goes from governor to become the president of the United States. And then in 1993 or 4, one of those, he passes the Clinton crime bill, which targets, guess what? Drug offenses more than anybody else. So he knows the drugs are coming in. He helped to facilitate that, and then they target the drugs, and you get stiffer sentences in the 3-strike rule, and they found out that minorities were being targeted for this, right? So this is some of the things that have happened, and I know people personally that were affected by this, and so there's a lot of things that are happening now to try to overturn, and you can imagine what happens to a community when a large portion of the males are incarcerated. You know the United States incarcerates more people than any other nation in the world. And as a matter of fact, there's 2 million people in prison in the United States, and that's more than China and some of these other countries. 2 million people. Out of the 2 million, half of them are people of color. And so statistically, 1 out of 8 incarcerated people in the world is an African American male. Yep. No, I'm not going to play the video. Breakdown of the family. National Center for Health Statistics in 2015 says 77.3% of non-immigrant black births were out of wedlock. The national immigration average is 42%, 30% for white people. Statistics have inverted. 22% of births were out of wedlock in the black community in the 1960s. So it goes from 22% in the 60s to 77% now, well in 2015, right? Now I'm going to show you why that happened, right? Just not a coincidence, and it doesn't have much to do with slavery, because the slavery had been abolished for 100 years in the 1960s. So from the 1960s to now, you see the greatest impact. Okay? All right, you still with me? You guys with me?
Yes.
You can say amen if you want. I'm going to pass this. Abortion rates, right? So abortion rates, even though black people only represent about 12 point something percent of the population, 35% of all abortions are done to African American women. And that was by design, right? Abortion is based on eugenics, and I'll talk very briefly about that. In New York City right now, more black babies are aborted than born. And we are in the United States right now that the black population is not replacing themselves. It's the only population right now that is decreasing statistically and birth rates, and it was done by design. They targeted, they put them in the black neighborhoods, these abortion clinics, and they convinced black people to do that. This is another statistic that shows, I'm sorry if you guys can't see it, I know I'm kind of in the way, but I'd be more than happy to share. I'll give you some of the postcards about the 2019 movement and how you can get in touch with me. I love to do this presentation in its totality and give thoroughness. Now, the gentleman, where's he at? The one who was up before me speaking.
Richard Penn.
There you go, right there in front of me. A lot of the stuff you talked about was so good because it wasn't just based on the stuff he talked about, but it has a ripple effect on all different areas of our culture. So these are some of the things. Some people call it white supremacy. I don't call it white supremacy. It's really the internationalists or the globalists.
Yep.
Okay, we all recognize that. But see, part of the strategy is the divide, right? Divide people into classes and have them fighting against each other. Saul Alinsky, right? Yeah. But guess what the Bible says Satan's greatest tool is? In Revelation 12, I think it is, it says he's the accuser of the brethren. That word accuser is the same word as katagoros, which means his greatest weapon is to separate us into categories and have us accusing us to each other. Right? So these are some of the people you can look up when you get a chance. Hegel, I'll talk very quickly about him. Karl Marx, you guys are all familiar with him, Marx and Engels. Right? Antonio Gramsci, this is the one I'm really going to focus a little bit on. The Frankfurt School and Tavistock Institute are two think tanks. When you get a chance, they help to frame and shape the Western ideology and culture. The gentleman talked about critical theory and some of the other philosophies. These are the things they designed. Charles Darwin and Francis Galton. I know you are familiar with Charles Darwin. Most of your children study what's known as the theory of evolution. It was coined by Charles Darwin. What people don't tell you is the subtitle to, it's called The Origin of the Species Through Natural Selection. The subtitle is The Preservation of the Favored Races in the Struggle for Life.
Wow.
So Charles Darwin and some of the others came up with this idea of race, which doesn't exist. There's no such thing as race. It's a social construct. The Bible doesn't separate people by race. It separates people by nations. Right? Skin color has nothing to do with it. But they created that as a way to oppress black people and to get other people not to go against what they believe, right? So if you believe that black people were less evolved, you were less likely to fight for equal rights for blacks, right? All right, you still with me?
Yes.
Amen, there you go. Galton came up with the idea of survival of the fittest.
I don't think that those people are the primary, they're not the primary shapers of Western culture.
Well,
they're not the foundation of Western culture.
What do you think they teach in school? They teach the theory of
Well,
evolution.
I'm not saying we haven't gone there, but they were not the foundation of
It's talking about the modern, maybe. Modern?
Modern.
Modern.
Right, yeah.
What we do nowadays,
Yeah,
I'm not
so
saying
about-
that the people who wrote the Constitution, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm saying that the influences that shape us, because our children are learning Darwin in schools. Yeah, today, right now. Yeah. So I'm with you. I'm not saying the shape framers of the Constitution. Darwin promoted race theory in order to promote racial inferiority.
Do you believe in sin? they believe. I don't even believe in committees. Do you believe there is such a thing as
That's Margaret Sanger.
I think the greatest sin in the world is bringing children into the world that have disease from their parents, that have no chance in the world to be a human being, practically. Delinquents, prisoners, all sorts of things just marked when they're born. That to me is the greatest sin.
So what she said was, the greatest sin was, and she called black people and other people human weeds. And she said they choked the resources from the more evolved races in this world. So, and guess what? The people that funded her, the Rockefeller family that funded Margaret Sanger, and it was actually called the American Hygiene Society. They were trying to clean up the society. The Rockefeller family at the same time was funding this guy by the name of Joseph Mengele, who was the Nazis. And they were doing the same thing with eugenics. It was the same thing. Eugenics is, getting rid of the human weeds, the less evolved. This was how it was in the turn of the 20th century. They had human pedigree. They actually used to make people register their pedigree to make sure that they weren't of a defective stock. Margaret Sanger says, the eugenic and civilization value of birth control is becoming apparent to the enlightened and the unintelligent. The campaign for birth control is not merely of eugenic value, but practically identical in idea with the final aim of eugenics. So birth control and eugenics was the mindset. She wanted to promote larger births in the better races and discourage it in the others. This is something called the Jaffe Memo. So this was in 1969, March 11th. Frederick Jaffe presented this. He was the president of Planned Parenthood to the Congress. And this is the Memorandum of Bernard Bergson, activities relevant to the study of population policy, also known as population control. So these were some of the ideas or suggestions they came up with how to control the population. So you have here encourage increased homosexuality. Fertility agents in the water supply. Anybody heard of, what was it in Michigan, Flint? Yeah. The agents in the water supply, they found out people knew that there was lead in the water. Redefine the family structure, abortion on demand. And this is the memo that goes with the memo. The memorandum is responsive to your letter January 24th seeking ideas or necessary and useful activities relevant to the formation of population policy defined as legislative measures, administrative programs, and other governmental actions that are designed to alter the population trends that actually do alter them. My observation will, and it says, the bottom part, it says, apart from the abstraction that in the long run a zero rate of population growth, you'll hear that zero sum. AOC, what's her name? That congressperson, she talks about zero sum population, right? Population now encouraging specific universal limit on family size as distinguished from proposals aimed selectively at welfare recipients and racial groups. So this was mainly to be targeting towards racial groups and people that were on welfare.
What was the name of that memo again?
The Jaffe, J-A-F-F-E, the Jaffe Memo. The Negro Dilemma, this is what they came up with in the beginning of the 20th century. You had all these freed slaves and black families. They were large families, right? Because on the plantation, on the farm, and you guys probably are familiar with farmers have big families. So they encourage them to have big families, but now that they're free and they have equal rights, they said that they're going to take over the wealth and the places that we live. So we have to come up, that's the Negro Dilemma, we got to come up with a way to keep them from having such large families. Birth control facilities, this book, American Dilemma, could be extended relatively more to Negroes than to whites since Negroes are more concentrated in the lower income and educated classes. They also came up with the idea of the cities. So hey, they herd black people up in the cities, in the inner cities, and they're confined. See, one of the biggest things that Martin Luther King fought was housing discrimination. Because they came up with a way to make sure black people stayed in certain areas, and then they had these things that they carried out. And guess what? The vast majority of cities they're run by that have the greatest difficulties for black people. Democrats, Democratic mayors. Chicago's been Democrats since the 1940s. Baltimore, Maryland, Philadelphia. I go on and on and on. It's part of the eugenics laws. It might seem like it's prehistoric, right? This one in Indiana wasn't overturned until 1977. Wow. They actually had sterilization laws, and the last person was sterilized under the sterilization eugenics laws was in, I think it was Washington State. It was in the 1980s. Ooh. So this is not something that happened a long time ago. Economically speaking, it shows that black people since 2000 have been the only class that has went down instead of went up. as far as household income and different things like that. Now, when you break down the family, that is a natural progression, right, that happens. And some of the other things that have happened. The Freedmen's Bureau was during the Reconstruction period. The Freedmen's Bureau was to help to compensate for the freed slaves and the whole idea of 40 acres of a mule, because they recognized the struggles. But then, of course, Andrew Jackson not only came and overturned the Freedmen's Bureau that was supposed to help, you know, when you recompense somebody, you just bring them back to where they should have been if you had intervened, right? It's not about giving them something that they didn't earn or deserve. It was giving them what was rightfully theirs. But here's the key. When he overturned it, he actually paid reparations to the slave owners for the slaves that they lost. They gave them like $300 per slave. And they took away the land that the Freedmen's Bureau had granted to many of these freed people. Now, 1870, you had these black congressmen, because black people, even though it was illegal for slaves to read, they couldn't teach them how to read. So you go from 1865 and 1870, you have these intelligent black men that are really, we thrived in adversity, right? And so, of course, the same time that happened, you have this other group, the Ku Klux Klan, that comes up, and their main job is to overturn what the Reconstruction period and stuff did. This is more things I'm not going to get in detail today. And of course, you know who what political party all these guys would have been in?
Democrats.
Democrat. Absolutely, yep. And that's without question. And that's not a judgment call, that's an actual fact, right? 1870, the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. Ulysses S. Grant won the United States election, right, in 1868. He won by 300,000 votes. 500,000 black people voted for Ulysses S. Grant, which meant without them, he wouldn't have won the presidency. Which is why they started to understand how important it was to try to get the black vote at all costs. And I'm going to talk about that real quick. Segregation, you had Plessy versus Ferguson, which was separate but equal, meant black people had to stay over in their place. They couldn't separate. You know, it was illegal for people to get married, for black people and white people to get married during the beginning of the 20th century. Interesting thing, you know the slogan of Virginia, right? Virginia's for lovers. It was the loving case that had to go to the Supreme Court that was in the state of Virginia that overturned the segregatory marriage laws. Isn't that crazy? It was the loving family. They wanted to get married, a white man and a black woman. Virginia fought against it. They had to go to the Supreme Court. It was the loving family. So Virginia, I don't know if that's sarcastic or what. Now they call it Virginia's for lovers. It wasn't, didn't used to be. Right? Might be now. So then you had Brown versus the Board of Education in the 1960s, and they determined that when you had these separate schools, all the black schools had less resources. So when you have much less resources for people of color, their opportunity isn't as great. We just want equal opportunity. We don't want equal outcomes is a good idea, but equal outcomes, you can't guarantee equal outcomes, just equal opportunity, right? Marcus Garvey was a great, great person. You guys might have heard, if you get a chance to look at it, he was what's called Pan-Africanism. Pan-African. He says, look, we just want you guys to leave us alone, let us prosper and raise our families and have our own businesses. He was a wealthy businessman. He said, we don't want handouts, we just want you guys to not burn our neighborhoods down when we have businesses, right? Yeah. And he says, we're going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery because while others might free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind. And that's been one of my themes for all life. Unfortunately, what happened, you have this Black Wall Street, which was Tulsa, when you guys get a chance to look at it, Allensworth and some other places. There was also a place in Arkansas. They had a thriving black community, and it was across the tracks from a white community. They got into a kind of a scuffle. The sheriff department came in, and actually they firebombed the black neighborhood. 300 black people got killed. Not one white person got convicted of any kind of crimes. And as a matter of fact, there was black people that got arrested because they were fighting back from being firebombed, and they said that they were causing a disturbance. So these are the type of things, even though we were prospering, the government intervened in taking that wealth away. They burned that whole prosperous neighborhood down. JFK wins. Real quick story. Dr. Alveda King is a good friend of mine. She told me the story years ago. So you had Nixon and you had Kennedy running, right, in the 1960s. Martin Luther King Jr. gets locked up in Alabama. They go to the King family goes back to both presidential candidates and says, can you help us? Nixon didn't do anything. JFK wrote a letter to the governor of Alabama saying, please make sure he's not killed while he's in prison, because that used to happen a lot. Black men used to go in jail back then and they just disappeared mysteriously. So So anyway, because Kennedy wrote the letter, the King family threw their weight behind JFK, and so then black people started to more and more become Democrats at that time because they believed that the Democrat Party was going to be fighting for their rights, the civil rights. This guy, Andrew Ramsey, he's an important figure if you get a chance. Real quick, let me give you I know I'm giving you a lot of information. Like I said, get in touch with me, I'll give you this stuff. He had this idea called cultural hegemony. Hegemony is the ruling class of people that they rule over the rest of them, right? And so you know communism and socialism, that's what it's about. It's about taking control and ruling over the working class and everybody else. But you know, and you guys probably heard in the beginning of the 20th century that happened, but when it happened, it was a lot of bloodshed. Millions and millions of people died. That was the #1 killing in the 20th century. It was called democide, death by government. So what happened is Ramsey thought it was terrible. He's in prison. He says, we got to come up with a better way to seize power from the masses. So cultural hegemony is the idea that you come in and you basically corrupt the culture in a way that people give their power over to the ruling class, the upper class. That was an idea. It's not a new one. It's one that was around for a long time. You had Karl Marx, Engels, and Hegel. You had what's called the Hegelian dialectic, which is you frame both sides of the argument and you have a pre-packaged solution. So they show you black people riding in the streets, and then white people say, oh, you got to get martial law in those neighborhoods, right? Or you have something happen to a black person, like on the television, they show a black male that gets killed by a cop. They show it over and over and over again. So now you have black people in panic saying they're killing black, they're hunting black people down. Now I'm not saying disproportionately there's not, racial profiling and stuff, but here's what I say to people. 2.5 times more white people have gotten killed by cops than blacks since 2015. I've never seen on CNN a white person that got killed by a cop. Why do they only show you when a black person gets killed? It's part of them helping to frame the narrative. And so we get in a panic mode because, look, cops are just going around gunning down black people, as opposed to saying cops need better training. You know what I'm saying? So, but it's part of what they do, and that's helping to shape people and move them into a certain already established results. This is what Aldous Huxley said. He wrote Brave New World. He was part of the think tanks, and he's basically telling what their strategy is. It says there will be a next generation or so, a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and produce dictatorships without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire society so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them but will rather enjoy it because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda, brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods. What are they pushing right now? Even in Pennsylvania. Marijuana. Stay high, right?
Yeah.
And you guys know that the gentleman back in the 60s, I can't think of his name, from Harvard. Timothy Leary. There's the same strategy. They was coming up with a way to get people to get so high that these young people no longer would protest about their oppression, right? And the last thing we want in the African American community is a bunch of young black males walking around high. It's not motivating. Right? You don't go out and split an atom after you smoke weed. You might think about it, but you never get off the couch to do it. This is how cultural hegemony affected the black community. Okay, LBJ was a racist.
Yes.
He used the N-word more than a gangster rapper. Right? So all of a sudden he goes from fighting against the civil rights bill to promoting it and passing it. So they asked him, why is it that you all of a sudden had this switch? Here's what his response was. These Negroes, they're getting pretty uppity, and these days, and that's a problem for us, since they got something that they never had before, they have a political pull to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference for. If we don't move at all, then our allies will line up against us, and there'll be no way of stopping them. We'll lose the filibuster, and there'll be no way of putting a break on all sorts of legislation that will be reconstructed. He said with his strategy, they'll have those N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years. And so what they did is they came up with what's known as the war on poverty. And they used the welfare system as a way to promote the breakdown of the family. See, this was the same idea Marx came up with. This was the same idea that's the ancient philosophy. And guess what? It was the same strategy that Pharaoh used. If you guys get a chance, look in the scriptures, Numbers 11, when Moses was bringing the children of Israel out of bondage, right? We keep talking about this 400-year pattern. One of the times that they wanted to rebel against Moses, they said, why'd you bring us out here in the wilderness to die? Because in Egypt, at least we got to eat the fish and the lentils for free. So they would rather stay in bondage, some of them, because they were getting free stuff. That was the same philosophy that they used. And when you have no fathers in the environment, right, the dad was the one who was supposed to teach the values and the culture. When you take the dad out of the families through targeting the males, guess who teaches the culture? Now the state becomes dad. And now you're dependent on them, and whatever party it is that supports that is the one you're going to support. Food stamp expenditures. You know, since the war on poverty in the 1960s, they spent $22 trillion to fight the war on poverty, but the poverty levels have not changed. The only thing that's changed is the family structure has gotten weaker. And remember I said with the Jaffe memo, part of what they did is they promoted abortion. So some of the poor people would actually get sterilized. They would go, if you were poor and you were uneducated, in some states they would actually do the baby, but then they would sterilize you. There was a lady who just won a lawsuit in 2008 from the state of North Carolina, and they admitted that they sterilized her. She was only a young girl. She said she had got abused. She got pregnant. After they took the baby, they sterilized her. She was never able to have it. So black unemployment burst, like I said, it was 22% in the 60s. Now it's about 77%. In 1960s, the black male had a 1 in 6 chance of being incarcerated. In 2017, black males had a 1 in 5 chance of being incarcerated. That means the probability of a black male getting incarcerated now goes up.
Does that mean Obama didn't help you out?
Absolutely not. And I didn't vote for him, so. Only because of his philosophy. Yeah, exactly. His principles didn't line up with me as a pastor. I don't accept those principles.
Amen.
Yeah. These are the images they promoted, right? So part of the cultural hegemony is you change the images. This is one of the most favorite rappers right now. His name is Kodak Black. Multi-platinum, has a bunch of money. This is Jim Crow. This is the image they used to use back in the turn of the century. This and this. These are images they used to use in the media to dehumanize black people. And they passed it off. So now you have these images to, right? And guess what? These record labels, they give a whole lot of money to these guys. These guys are worth millions of dollars to promote a gang culture, sexism, all this other stuff, criminality. And there's a letter, and I won't share it with you today, but there's an actual letter that they said that the record labels actually started at the late 80s, started to put money into gangster rap in order to promote criminal culture to increase the criminal justice population. Some of you may not know that a lot of these federal prisons are privatized, means they're for profit and they trade on the stock market.
Clinton again.
And the municipalities that have a contract with them, they actually get penalized if they don't keep a certain population in those prisons.
President Clinton.
Yeah, absolutely. Now I will say, for the record, both parties are victims to this. Democrats kind of spearheaded it, but the Republican Party has done very little to help it. They actually they get money from the privatized prisons too, right? So we want to be honest and open, right, all the way across the board. I'm not going to play this. Thomas Sowell, if you get a chance to listen to him, awesome guy. I love his stuff. You know, I quote him in some of my books, but he's just a phenomenal guy. But
I'm hoping to use this conversation.
I'm not going to play it now, it's too long. But I just wanted to, there's so much more I'd love to share with you and go in more detail. Of course, for the sake of time, I'm not going to. But I just want you guys to understand that in order for us to move forward, we have to not only look at the past as a way to move forward, but we also have to look at some of the challenges that are currently. I'm going to leave you with this statistic. In 2009, I think it was, had a gentleman from Hartford, Connecticut. He asked me to come up and speak to his middle school. He's a middle school teacher. He says, my first book was called Kilos to the Kingdom. It's about my prodigal son experience and how God transformed me, right? And how my thought process changed. He said, I'd love for you to come up and speak to my class. He says, Hartford, Connecticut, the inner city school is predominantly Hispanic and black. He said, but just before you come up, I need you to understand, we had a 67% dropout rate. I said, you only have 67% graduate? He said, no, 67% of the students in Hartford, Connecticut, city schools drop out of school before graduation. Wow. So I talked to my uncle who retired from Harrisburg School District. He said, that's about what Harrisburg is. Harrisburg City Schools, that's another state capital. They published it a couple years ago. They had a 38% graduation rate. Wow. Now, chances are, statistically speaking, if you don't graduate from high school, there's a high probability that you end up in prison. I talked to a friend from Louisville, Kentucky, exact same story. Now, of course, all these are democratic cities, right? But what I want you to understand, it is very real, because if you live in an environment where only 38% of those graduate, you're not thinking about, I'm going to be a doctor or a lawyer. The whole environment is shaped wrong, right? But see, what happens is, when these things happen, we are still doing it, and they used to have, the privatized prisons, they used to have, they used to go into 4th grade in inner cities and do the reading levels, and the kids that were reading below level, they start planning a prison cell for them 20 years in advance. That was their business plan. And so these things happen, and that's why it's so important for us to understand what's happening in the culture. But my job is to talk on both sides, right? To give the issue from a truthful standpoint, to let people know that these issues are real, but how do we move together? How do we reconcile with each other, right? That's why we did the prayer of forgiveness, because people, especially black people, say, you told us all this stuff, and then you talk about forgive, because we have to be empowered in this time to be able to move beyond that. So when you see black people rioting in certain areas, they're not rioting about slavery, they're rioting about some of the stuff that they're dealing with right now. So how do we have that conversation to know that it's important, because it affects us all at one point in time, right? These kids that go to jail, instead of taking care of them on the front end, you're going to have to deal with them. Either your tax dollars are going to pay for them when they're in jail, right? Or they're going to be on welfare, your tax dollars are going to pay for them. Or guess what? The worst part is they're going to be breaking in your house, because there's no opportunities where they live, and you got something that they don't have. So it's going to affect us one way or another. I tell people all the time, we're going to raise other people's children one way or another. I'd rather raise them on the front end than have to raise them on the back end, right? And I do believe in America. I believe this is the greatest country on this side of heaven, and I think that the best is yet to come, but we have to get through some of this mess, sort through this mess in order to get to where we need to get to, right? God bless America.
Can we have a question, one or two questions, or?
If Brother Cook will sacrifice a little bit of time, we'll give you an honor preferring one another, and you're the head of the overseer.
Brother, leave that computer up a second.
Leave it up?
Yeah, I got a PowerPoint, I might something to put things up separate.
Oh, you want to set up? Okay, gotcha.
Well, I got one quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen, we're hearing better statistics as far as what President Trump's done to the black community?
Yes.
Have you seen those numbers move at all? Have you seen any kind of good impact on that?
Here's what I know for a fact, and I'm on this federal commission, I'm down in D.C. back and forth. So the one thing is he's focusing on criminal justice reform. Right now, some of that Obama kind of started a little bit, but they didn't really push any of that. He's focusing on criminal justice reform, that's for sure. He's also focusing on what's called opportunity zones. And you guys may or may not, when they had the new tax codes, when he put them in place in 2017, it created 8,000 opportunity zones all over the country. And now you get private and public funding coming in to help build up the communities. And it's not a handout or entitlement program. You have to come up with something that will help your community. And you have private equity guys that will come in, they get tax benefits for helping to build up the community. So these are tremendous things. And last time I heard, I was on a conference call last week, they said hundreds of millions of dollars, hundreds of billions, and possibly trillions of dollars are now identified in order to help build up the inner cities.
Right.
So, and it's not just, but primarily most of them are in inner cities, but some of them are in rural areas as well. They go by poverty and all that other stuff.
What about the unemployment figure?
Oh, well, yeah, unemployment, black unemployment is the lowest it's ever been in the history of them.
So that's legit.
Since the 60s.
That's legit.
Well, since they started,
Yeah.
Also, black business ownership has increased, last I heard, it's like 200 or 300%. So, it's a positive thing, and I believe and hope that as long as we keep pushing this defunding Planned Parenthood, the black abortion rate will go down.
Yeah.
Right?
I noticed in Oakland that even 10 years ago, there was a lot of black businesses, black-owned businesses in Oakland. So I don't know who that was, but the city isn't doing good.
Well, what happens is,
I don't understand.
Oakland and some of those places, they were very much about self-empowerment. A lot of people, they painted, see what happened with the Black Panthers in the 60s, it was a breakfast program, because a lot of these, and to your point, brother, a lot of these young kids in poverty are going to school, they don't have any money to eat breakfast. Right, so they came up with programs, and it's hard to learn when you don't have any food or, dirty clothes. I dealt with a lot of inner city children. So anyway, they had strong communities and strong businesses, but with this cultural hegemony thing, it took them off the idea of being self-sufficient, and now they're more dependent on the government. When you're more dependent on the government, it perpetuates a cycle of poverty and dependency on the government. Because that's why, what did God say? God says we're supposed to look out for the widows and the orphans. When we look out, the church looks out for the widows and the orphans, we break the cycle of dependency and dysfunction, right? But when the government does it, it funnels it, it fuels it.
Confusion.
So that's part of what happens with this, but it's all based on socialism, because the ultimate goal of socialism, which is communism, is to get more dependency on the government.
But keep you on a leash.
Yes,
We'll throw you a dog
because you
bone.
can't go against the government if the government's raising your family, right?
We'll keep
What
you
about
alive,
charter
keep you
schools?
dry.
Charters, what do you think?
I'm all for school choice
School choice.
and those type of things. Because if you have a child, here's what happens in a lot of these communities. There are some children who really want to learn. But if their whole environment is about failing school and your guy on the right and your left, they're not doing school and they're distracting to you, it's hard. So what school choice does is say, if you live in right now, if you live in a certain school district, you got to go there. If you live in a 38% graduation rate school district, that's where your kid's supposed to go unless you have enough money to go to a private school. But if you have school choice and vouchers, you can say, my child can go to the school based on what he can achieve.
Yeah.
And so now you kind of fuel that desire and ambition to be a doctor. Even though nobody in my family is a doctor, I want to be a doctor, and I'm going to go through what it takes to become a doctor. And that helps to promote that.
Okay.
And I tell black people, socialism was something we prospered when we were self-sufficient. And so the enemy knows that, right? Because we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but we wrestle against despotism, governmental oppression in high places, right? And that's what their job is to do.
Are the black universities getting the left ideology as well?
Oh, it's the ancients. Here's what did Pharaoh do? When Pharaoh wanted to destroy the black community, the Israelite community, I'm sorry. When he wanted to destroy the community, he identified people from the community to get help. So what you have is this idea of what's called the black boule. They identify people from the community that are influential and intelligent, and they help to promote the ideologies of the oppressors. So for instance, Jesse Jackson used to be super pro-life in the 1970s. He ran for president in the 80s. He got a bunch of money from Planned Parenthood. Now he's pro-choice.
Yeah.
So that's what they do. They help to promote the ideas. And I've had conversations with a lot of them, and I'm like, abortion was based on race and eugenics. But yet they don't fight against it. So that's how they got, and even in the black schools, they did that. The very liberal, because if you talk to 90% of black people, if you go issue by issue, most of them are conservatives. Pro-God, pro-family, pro-life, right?
Pro-church.
Pro-church.
Church dinners.
Yeah, but yet they were able to, through that cultural hegemony, get them to support the very strategies of their oppressors.
Yeah.
Hallelujah.
Thank you.
But I believe that the time is now. The Great Awakening is happening.